ABC News Special Report.
The latest on those terror attacks that unfolded in Barcelona, Brussels, Belgium,
of London,
Jakarta, Indonesia,
German wings
of Paris and St. Petersburg, Russia. And tonight, ISIS now claiming responsibility.
Terrorism is a topic, an event, or a group of, or all three that affects us today. It affects the people's sense of safety abroad, the people's mindsets, our politics, our foreign policy, and our interaction among nations around the world. This, however, sparks the question, when and where did this all come from and originate from? And the answer is surprisingly complex, but all fits in together, and it leads up to the Soviet-Afghanistan War, in which it sparked a resistance of Islamic militants against the Soviets' acts of aggression in Afghanistan, and thus provoked the United States to fund these militants, whom they evolved into terrorist groups we know today, and committing acts of terror around the world. In the Middle East, there was heavy Western and Soviet influence in the region. The United States and Japan supported the area because of its oil reserves. The Soviets, however, tried to undermine Western influence using various tactics. For one, they supported the Arab League and Palestine Liberation Organization, and they pumped money and arms into countries like Syria and Iraq, and had heavy military presence in the area. However, Soviet influence and presence in the area wasn't greatly accepted. The president of Egypt at the time, Anwar Sadat, feared of excess Soviet influence and expelled 20,000 Soviet advisors and steered towards America. And this was the first sign of Soviet Union's influence being unwelcomed and rejected. Enter the Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet Union advances on Kabul to back up its communist, pro-Soviet, unpopular government and to shield it from outside attacks and to keep it propped up in Afghanistan. In April of 1978, Afghanistan's centrist government was overthrown by left-wing military officers led by Nur Muhammad Taraki. Power was shared by the two Marxist political groups, which were the People's Caliph Party and the Parakhan Banner Party. The government was unpopular and faced bitter resentment by the Muslim-dominant population, and conflict arose. The invasion was under the guidance of Soviet commander Leonid Brezhnev, and the invasion was provoked after Islamic militant guerrillas had major fighting conflicts with the Afghan communist government. After the invasion, this caused a massive anti-communist and Muslim insurgency. These tribal and urban groups of Islamic orientation collectively were known as the Mujahideen, Arabic for those who engage in jihad. The rebellion of the Mujahideen spread to most of the country. The Soviet-Afghan War quickly grew into stalemate. The Soviet Union had 100,000 troops stationed in Afghanistan, controlling major cities and towns. The Mujahideen moved around the country with relative ease and freedom, and eluded most Soviet attacks. The war in Afghanistan caught the attention of the United States, and seeing that these were anti-communist forces, the United States wanted to support the group. This, however, wasn't anything new, as the United States generally supported anything anti-communist since it was the Cold War at the time. However, this produced some disastrous results, just like when the United States supported the South Vietnamese forces in the Vietnam War. However, even with past history of supporting anything anti-communist producing disastrous results, the United States decided to proceed forward. This then sparks the question, who are the Mujahideen and what are they doing in Afghanistan? The Mujahideen were a group of militants that were of Islamic orientation and vowed to protect the values of Islam and to protect the Muslim people. Throughout the war, the group remained to be fragmented and the majority of their efforts and actions were uncoordinated. But they all had the relatively same goal, to drive out the Soviet forces and the Communist Party and to maintain their Islamic values in Afghanistan. Over the duration of the war, the quality and quantity of the arms of the Mujahideen greatly increased, and so did their combat organization and munitions supply. Also, the Mujahideen got many volunteer militants from around the world, regardless of ethnicity, to join the opposition. And this is where the compromise occurs. The U.S. was prompted by the acts of Soviet aggression to promote and provide aid to the Mujahideen. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter approved covert aid to the Mujahideen guerrilla fighters. The aid at first was forms of non-military aid, such as cash that the Mujahideen could use to purchase weapons. 6 months later, the Soviet Union sent troops further into Afghanistan. This prompted the advocation by the National Security Advisors to send more money, and this time to include arms and munitions as well. The aid was sent through Pakistan, China, and various Muslim countries. For the next decade, the CIA guided the guerrillas with weapons purchases from China, Egypt, and Pakistan. The US later provided the highly sophisticated munitions of their own, such as the Stingray. In all, the US supplied some $2 to $3 billion worth of aid in forms of cash, arms, munitions, and materials to the Mujahideen. All this aid was sent with the assistance of the Pakistan Intelligence Services, or the PSI, through various countries. The PSI also provided training to the guerrilla fighters, and the CIA only had contact with the Mujahideen on very rare occasion. The US only pursued to have some sort of relations with the Mujahideen only because of the Soviets in Afghanistan. Even though the US rarely had any contact with the Mujahideen, the US trusted them and their aid and viewed them as an ally to the US. Like I said, the US had a history of supporting anything anti-communist, even if those groups weren't the best, and that still lives on today. Take a look at Syria. The United States is supporting the Syrian rebels because the US is not on good terms with Assad, and see the rebels as an opportunity to possibly weaken Assad. However, the Syrian rebels are believed to have links and relations with terrorist groups and are committing their own acts of Islamic extremism. The war and the aid and the relation that the US had with the Mujahideen ended when the Soviet Union's efforts collapsed. One might say that the war in Afghanistan caused the demise of the Soviet Union, but that's beside the point. Once the war in Afghanistan was over, the US essentially cut off all ties it created with the Mujahideen, whom now evolved into the Taliban, and did so for maybe good reason. So you might think that the war is over, the Soviet Union is driven out, and the Mujahideen has won. The conflict is over, right? Wrong. The conflict may appear to be gone, but that's anything but the permanent solution, and the peace was only temporary. And this is giving to the rise of modern terrorism. Terrorism before 9/11 was not to the scale we know today. Terrorist attacks did occur, and one on American soil actually did happen, which was the World Trade Center parking garage bombings. Most terrorist attacks were in the Middle East, or were in Muslim countries. Most of these terrorist attacks were linked to two groups who had the same goal and had connections with each other. Osama bin Laden was known to have links with the Taliban, and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden were known to support each other in terms of monetary support, military activities, or terrorist attacks. The Taliban and Osama bin Laden swore oaths to each other and committed people, money, and resources to establish terrorist training camps and to carry out acts of terrorism. This was sparked when Osama bin Laden saw U.S. troops stationed in Saudi Arabia and viewed it as an offense to the Muslim world. He then declared a holy war on the United States. Attacks against the U.S. was generally abroad at first. Such attacks like the embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Many U.S. active duty personnel, such as the troops of the 33rd Air Rescue and Recovery Squadron, was sent to Africa and Saudi Arabia to help and rescue the victims of the embassy bombings. With more U.S. service personnel in the region, the more offended Osama bin Laden got, and the more obliged he felt to carry out acts of terrorism against the United States. 9/11 was a major terrorist attack on American soil, and it ultimately changed how we live in the U.S. for the rest of time. These attacks were carried out by Al-Qaeda, a group led by Osama bin Laden, in which it had connections with the Taliban. Planes were hijacked by these Al-Qaeda militants and were intentionally crashed into the World Trade Centers and the Pentagon, and one plane crashed into the ground in Pennsylvania by the heroic efforts of the passengers on board determined to take control of the plane from these Al-Qaeda militants. The results were devastating. With almost 3,000 people dead and countless injured, the aviation industry was changed forever and was vastly devastated. The security of our nation was breached, and Bush declared a war on terrorism days later.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists, and every government that supports them.
This is also the footprint of the famous speech, The Axis of Evil. There are many terrorist groups today, and many terrorist attacks occurred, unfortunately. Some include ISIS, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, Al-Shabaab, Ansar al-Sharia, Ansaru, Boko Haram, Hezbollah, and many more. Terrorist attacks of a wide variety occurred in London, Brussels, Paris, Jakarta, New York City, Los Angeles, Baghdad, Tunisia, and too many more places to list. These groups were inspired or funded or were subdivisions of larger, more powerful terrorist groups but have almost one common origin: the Taliban and Afghanistan.